It's not quite like being able to go and do all sorts of other things. But it's been terribly enjoyable and marvellous to see so many people, and I've been all over the place.
For decades, the British monarchy has been cloaked in tradition, mystery, and secrets. But now King Charles has broken the silence. At 75, he has finally admitted to something so dark, so unexpected, it could shake the very pillars of the crown. What could a king possibly be hiding? And why now? To understand why this confession is so shocking, we need to rewind to where it all began. His childhood as a prince born into power but trapped in silence.
I'd be delighted. Try it anytime they like. But like all people's jobs, you'll find that it isn't actually what it appears to be.
King Charles was born on November 14, 1948, into a life already written for him. As the first child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, he wasn't just born into royalty, he was born into expectation. From the very beginning, his every move was watched, guided, and shaped to fit the role of a future king. But behind the privilege was a pressure few could understand. As a child, Charles didn't get the kind of emotional closeness most children rely on. His mother, then Princess Elizabeth, became queen when he was just 3 years old. From that point on, her role as monarch often took priority over her role as a mother. Prince Philip, his father, came from a military background and believed in toughening up his son. The royal household followed strict traditions where emotions were rarely shown and everything had to appear perfect to the outside world. Charles was raised in palaces, but his childhood wasn't filled with comfort. His early years were dominated by formality, nannies, public appearances, and carefully managed routines. He was often described as sensitive, quiet, and thoughtful, which clashed with the royal family's preference for strength, discipline, and emotional control. This made him stand out, not in a good way, and added more pressure to become someone he naturally wasn't. When it came time for his education, Charles was sent to Gordonston in Scotland, a boarding school known for its harsh environment and physical challenges. Prince Philip had also gone there and believed it would build character. But for Charles, the experience was miserable. He was lonely, homesick, and often bullied. He once described the school as Colditz in kilts, comparing it to a grim wartime prison. Instead of building confidence, the experience only deepened his insecurities and isolation. Despite these personal struggles, Charles had to put on a polished front for the public. As he grew older, he stepped into royal duties with increasing visibility. He was constantly photographed, analyzed, and judged by the press. Even as a teenager, he had little room to make mistakes or discover himself privately. Every move was managed. Every smile was calculated. Every step was toward the throne. But even as the young prince smiled for cameras, a quiet storm grew under the surface, one rooted in identity, expectations, and personal truth. As he entered adulthood, Charles was quickly pulled deeper into the public role. In 1969, he was formally invested as the Prince of Wales at a highly choreographed ceremony in Caernarfon Castle. It was a defining moment meant to mark his readiness for the future crown. But behind the pomp and symbolism, Charles was still trying to figure out who he really was. He also began military training, including time in the Royal Navy. On the surface, it was a tradition of royal service, but for Charles, it added to the weight of expectation. Every stage of his life was already decided with little space for personal choice. One of the few people Charles confided in was his great-uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten played a complicated role, both a mentor and a manipulator. He pushed Charles to think about marriage early, warning him not to wait too long and advising him to choose a suitable bride, not necessarily someone he loved. This guidance set the stage for one of the most complicated chapters in Charles's life. By the time Charles hit his 30s, the pressure to marry wasn't just coming from inside the palace walls. It was coming from the public too. The royal family needed stability, and the future king needed a wife. But instead of marrying for connection or compatibility, Charles was steered towards someone who could fit the image of a royal princess. And then came Diana, beloved by the people, but their fairy tale was far from magical behind closed doors.
I suspect most husbands and wives find that they often have arguments.
But we don't.
No. But occasionally we do, because,
Tom Brooks met Diana Spencer when she was just a teenager, only 16 years old at the time. He had been dating her older sister briefly, but it was Diana who eventually caught the royal family's attention. She was young, shy, came from an aristocratic background, and had the kind of clean public image that made her perfect for the role of a future queen. For Charles, though, things weren't so simple. Their courtship was short and, by many accounts, awkward. There was a noticeable lack of emotional chemistry between them, but that didn't stop the pressure from building. At 32, Charles was being pushed harder than ever to settle down. Diana, at just 19, was chosen more for her appearance and reputation than for a real personal connection. Even Charles admitted later that he felt uncertain before proposing. When asked during their engagement interview if they were in love, Diana responded, "Of course," while Charles infamously replied, "Whatever in love means." Still, the wedding went forward in 1981. It was a global spectacle watched by hundreds of millions and celebrated as a fairy tale. But that illusion began to crumble almost immediately after the ceremony. Diana quickly realized that palace life was cold and isolating, she had little guidance, and was expected to adapt to royal duties overnight. Meanwhile, Charles grew more distant, uncomfortable with Diana's sudden popularity and media attention, which often overshadowed him. Even worse, there was another woman in the background the entire time, Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles had dated Camilla before marrying Diana, and their connection never truly ended, though he claimed to have remained faithful in the early years of the marriage. His relationship with Camilla resumed behind closed doors. Diana sensed it. She later said in interviews that she knew there were 3 of us in this marriage. Their marriage became a slow-motion collapse. Publicly, they still appeared together at events, smiling for cameras. Privately, they lived separate lives filled with resentment, misunderstanding, and emotional pain. Diana struggled with mental health issues, including depression and bulimia, which the palace largely ignored. Charles, unable or unwilling to connect emotionally, retreated further into royal obligations and his private circle. By the early 1990s, the truth was out. Reports of affairs, arguments, and emotional distance could no longer be hidden. In 1992, they officially separated. 4 years later, they divorced. The fairy tale had officially ended, but the scars from that period stayed with Charles long after. But it wasn't just infidelity that haunted Charles. It was a hidden truth about himself, one he buried deeper than anyone imagined.
I don't think I am. I'm a perfectionist with myself, but not necessarily with everybody else. Because there's far too much about me in the newspapers, far too much. It horrifies me when there's something more important, like what goes on in the hospice, or there's been a bomb or something. They'll put me on the front page.
As fans picked apart the pieces of his failed marriage, something deeper lingered within Charles. Insiders over the years described him as someone who often felt out of place, like a misfit within his own royal destiny. He was born into a role that didn't align with who he was personally. His interests in art, spirituality, the environment, and philosophy clashed with the monarchy's rigid traditions and obsession with appearances. He privately confided to close friends and advisors that he felt trapped, not just in his marriage, but in the larger role he was expected to play for life. Unlike his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who embodied the monarchy with discipline and duty, Charles often struggled with it. He was more reflective, emotional, and sensitive. Those traits were often viewed as weaknesses within the royal structure. There were moments when the pressure visibly cracked through. His interviews were sometimes awkward or emotionally revealing, catching the public off guard. At times, he seemed frustrated, even bitter, about how his life had been shaped without choice. He didn't openly rebel, but he also didn't fully conform, and that made him harder to relate to for many people. Over the years, palace insiders worked hard to manage his image. They tried to project him as a prepared and steady future king, but behind that image was a man still trying to find peace with a life he hadn't asked for. He was in many ways a monarch in waiting, who never felt fully at ease with what that meant. And now, years later, with a crown on his head and time running short, Charles has decided to speak.
As from what I can tell, and obviously there are problems here and there, inevitably. Nothing's ever perfect, and that people have lots of complaints.
In a recent interview, King Charles broke from the royal script in a way few expected. Known for carefully worded statements and polished appearances, this time he spoke with striking honesty. He admitted deep personal regret, especially about how he handled his marriage to Diana. While he didn't go into every detail, his words carried weight. He acknowledged that he had failed to understand her pain, saying he wished he had listened more and been more present during the most fragile years of their relationship. He also shared concerns about the future of the monarchy. For the first time in decades, a reigning monarch publicly questioned whether the institution can continue to serve in the same way in a modern world. It wasn't a declaration of change, but it was a rare moment of vulnerability, openly wondering if the crown still fits the country it represents. His tone was personal, his language candid. There was no dodging, no vague royal phrasing. He spoke like a man reflecting on a life shaped more by duty than desire. And it's impossible to ignore how this ties into Prince Harry and Meghan's ongoing tensions with the crown. The decision to step back from royal duties was based in part on feeling unsupported and unheard. In many ways, Charles's admission matched some of the same themes, being trapped in a system that values silence over emotion. Whether intentionally or not, he may have opened the door for a more transparent royal future, something Harry and Meghan have pushed for from the start. What do you think about King Charles's dark secret? Was this confession brave or too little too late? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more royal updates.